I think we're good to, I'll start my introduction. Let's just get into it. So thanks everyone for joining us here in person and virtually. We have a really great privilege today to talk within our community with a great thinker and voice of our time. I'm our moderator today, but I didn't do this alone. My co-moderator unfortunately couldn't make it today due to a personal matter. Her name's River Feldman, and she's been a really good consultant organizer helping me do this because this is my first time doing this sort of thing. I want to thank the Global Justice Center for hosting us here today, Language Justice Collective for obviously everything they've helped us set up, and especially Vijay for being here today and giving us some of his time. So I'm really grateful that this is all coming to fruition here. Who am I? I'm a resident of Tucson, and I had this idea for a talk because I'm concerned about U.S. society's complicity in global migration and the crisis at our southern border. And so I want to create a discourse on this for our community on this topic. I study journalism. I have a degree in journalism, but I work at a local nonprofit seed bank here in town. And organizing this talk has been kind of a fun little side free time project of mine. So if anyone is curious and wants to collaborate in the future, let's do that. My name is Justin Risley. A lot of my friends call me JR. So reach out for sure. It's my pleasure to introduce Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist. He's the author of 40 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, and The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. Oh, and just recently on Cuba, The Withdrawal and On Cuba, both written with Noam Chomsky. He is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief correspondent for Globetrotter and chief editor of Leftward Books. Thanks, Vijay, for being here today. All right.
Thanks a lot. It's very, very great to be with you. And I'm glad that I'm with you the first time you're doing this. So that's great.
Cool. Thank you. So I want to establish a greater context to how migration to the southern border today is not exclusive to the U.S., as we may feel it is often here because of the brutality that we see so close to our homes. And it's actually a symptom of a global trend. So that's why the emphasis on the word global and global migration, the southern border is important because it acknowledges not only the flow of people across the border, but the forces of economic globalization and imperialism which fuel this trend. So Vijay, if we can just get into like definitions of the types of migrants that we're having today that don't really maybe align with the traditional international legal definitions that are set by treaties. And how has this shifted? And with that shift, how does this unofficial expansion of the definition impact migration policy?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I think the first thing I would say is for people who don't keep up with the numbers, the last International Organization of Migration, that's the UN's body that tracks migrants and provides services as well for migrants at certain crucial crossing points, such as in Niger, just at the bottom of the Sahara Desert. The International Organization of Migration says that there are about 281 million migrants in the world today. Now, that number is extraordinary because it's the fourth largest country in the world. The largest two countries in the world have enormous populations. That's China and India. And then the third largest country by population is the United States, with about 300 and some million people. The fourth largest country is a country of migrants. All the migrants put together comprise the fourth largest country. Now, it's interesting. The UN strict definition of migration is worth attending to. The UN strict definition of migrant is anybody who crosses a border, regardless of their legal status, is a migrant. I mean, this is not a very well-known definition. People sort of emphasize the legal element of it. Have you crossed legally? The UN doesn't consider legality or illegality to be an issue. Anybody who's crossed a border is a migrant. And that's how you get, roughly the 281 million number. But let's go back to the international treaty. That's how the UN understands it. There is an international treaty, not on migration, and that's important. The international treaty is on refugees. There's a difference between migrants and refugees. And there is really no international treaty on migration. The International Organization of Migration operates with the goodwill of the United Nations. But really, all countries haven't agreed on what counts as migration. And I'm sure we'll get to that, why that is so. But they are agreed on what counts as a refugee. Most countries in the world have signed the 1951 Convention on Refugees. This is a UN convention. It's legally binding. It's not just a standard that is set. It's a legally binding treaty. And in this, it actually, because the Soviet Union was absent from the UN at the time when this was negotiated, the Soviets were angry because of the way in which the People's Republic of China had been set aside, and the seat for China was given to the Republic of China or Taiwan in 1949. And so when this was being negotiated, Soviets were not there. So the Convention on Refugees actually is heavily framed by the interests of the United States. And in that convention, there are really just a few ways to understand refugees. One is people who are fleeing oppression. This is generally described as political persecution. And those people can get asylum, almost automatically. And there is a principle for that and so on. That's really the main framework in the 1951 convention. It's extremely narrow. It's about asylum seeking for political persecution. Over the years, other ideas have come in. For instance, if a woman claims that she is, under threat because of patriarchal violence, she can apply for asylum. They've sort of opened up the definition of persecution. Religious persecution counts in some countries, not all. Some countries accept religious persecution as grounds for seeking asylum. But it's basically individuals who face persecution, whether it's political, in some cases patriarchal, in some cases religious. That's the limit of it. Unfortunately for the world, most migrants, and indeed most refugees, because now we get into the dilemma, what's a migrant, what's a refugee? Most migrants, most refugees aren't fleeing strictly political persecution or religious persecution or patriarchal violence, although patriarchal violence is so commonplace, it intersects with other things. Most people are fleeing because their countries are being destroyed. And I think there's just no room in the treaty framework for that. You can't arrive at a border and say, listen, you bombed my country, and therefore you need to take me in. You destroyed my agriculture. You used Agent Orange, and I can't farm anymore. So I'm going to come and farm in Iowa. Unfortunately, that's not an argument that a US border official is going to take seriously. So some time back, I wrote an article, and I'll end with this, in which I emphasize three new kinds of refugees that we should really take in hand. One is the International Monetary Fund refugee. What happens if the IMF shows up in a country and just over the years corrodes its ability, its sovereignty? People can't, feed themselves, can't find jobs and so on. Shouldn't we have room for IMF refugees, people whose economies have been destroyed by this form of neoliberal policy making that emanates from Washington, D.C.? Second, what about regime change refugees? People whose homes have been bombed, the Iraqis, for instance, whose homes had been bombed, or what happens to people from Libya? Country was destroyed by NATO's war. And regime change, of course, doesn't only happen through bombing. It happens, as you said, through sanctions and maximum pressure campaigns against countries like, Venezuela. 6 million Venezuelan refugees. The country is 27 million or so. That's a lot of people leaving the country. Regime change refugees, the second, and the third being climate change refugees. Now, the third is interesting. There has been some discussion at the COP meetings, the Conference of Parties, on the issue of the destruction of nature and climate change. There's been some questions raised about, broadly, climate change, refugees, very broad. But nobody's really taking it seriously. So in this article, I just offered up that, in fact, the narrow 1951 treaty, the Convention on Refugees, is insufficient. It's not fit for purpose anymore, that we need a new treaty process to have a discussion about IMF refugees, regime change refugees, and climate change refugees. And I'm sure people could add more as you put more thought to it. So I think that's about where we are. 280 million refugees today. That's the UN's number. I expect this is an underestimate. But most of the people who are migrants and refugees are not actually able to, claim some kind of protection from international law because they simply don't fit in the categories of international law.
I think we'll just dive into the next part of how we're getting here and with imperialism. And so, question I drafted up here is, I've noticed, at least in community, a little bit a lack of an anti-imperialist critique when discussing these greater causes and the causes of these definitions that you just stated. Obviously, we're not going to see this critique in mainstream outlets or the extravaganza of this election year. But at the community level, those are the organizations that initiate these conversations and guide public awareness towards support for humane border policy. And so how can community level advocates integrate this what critiques should they be integrating, and how can they integrate this critique? And more importantly, be more internationally informed, on their framework. I think having an international approach for how we think about the border here in Southern Arizona is going to be crucial.
Yeah, personally, I'm not going to surrender the argument as quickly as you did when you said we don't expect mainstream outlets to do this or that. I mean, the fact is, I think it's important, firstly, to just say that a lot of media coverage is just not sufficient. It's not explanatory. How do you explain that suddenly on the US border, there's an enormous number of people from Haiti, enormous number of people from Venezuela? How do you explain that? Did they just arrive by magic? Why is it that people from El Salvador are arriving at the border, and then from Los Angeles, they're deporting young Salvadoran Americans who've never been to El Salvador. Some of them don't speak Spanish, back to El Salvador. What's going on? Just by saying there are Haitians sitting at the border or sleeping under a freeway overpass, that doesn't explain anything. What's happened to the media? It's not explanatory anymore. It's a media that is not explanatory, that doesn't try to explain reality, is a media that becomes sensationalist. One day 50 migrants, next day 100 migrants, next day 3 migrants, whatever. The headline, migrants at the border, it's a sensationalism. I don't see how a population is better served or well served by sensationalism. The media has to perform an educative task. It's pedagogical. They have to be teaching people about what's happening in the world. I think that aspect is really something one has to fight for. After all, television channels and so on broadcast on public airwaves and through public cables and so on. You have to fight for that. I mean, but given, you're exactly correct, given that they are basically sensationalist and not pedagogical, it falls on community organizations, trade unions, people's organizations, and so on to be doing the pedagogic function. I mean, so much of popular politics among the people, is also a kind of pedagogy. There's a reason why Fidel Castro used to speak for 3 hours. He was doing a seminar for the Cuban nation. It was like a classroom seminar. That's politics. That's socialist politics, is really about pedagogy, bringing people into a conversation, saying that one cannot have a sensationalist attitude to the migrant issue because it doesn't provide you with an explanation about what's happening. So I think I just want to say that because I resist the impulse to dismiss them, because we have to fight them and say, you can't talk like that. Yeah, that you're doing a disservice to the national conversation. The second point, and I think this here you are really absolutely correct, which is, you know, how does one talk about, like, let's take regime change refugees? How does one talk about that? Now, based on the 1951 convention, there can be an argument made by the refugees, and many of them do that, is they say we are fleeing political persecution. That, you know, Venezuela, they will make an argument, is a dictatorship, and we fled the dictatorship, and we are asking for asylum. It actually behooves migrants to follow the Convention of Refugees. You know, sorry, my dog is a little angry with the other dog. Yeah. So, you know, the issue is when a migrant arrives at the border, why wouldn't they use the basic principles of, you know, of the 1951 convention? Because in fact, the 1951 convention suits their purpose. You can then portray Venezuela as a, you know, as a dictatorship and say that's where it is. Because the treaties that we have don't within them don't within them talk about you know, regime change and things like that. There's no space in the treaty to have a discussion about those aspects of actual human life. So what happens is the treaty framework we have from 1951 actually creates and reproduces a Cold War perspective on conflicts taking place today. Because of the treaty perspective, a migrant has to show up at the border of the United States, and if they want to get, you know, refugee or asylum or migrant some kind of status, they have to claim that they were victims of political persecution. In fact, most of them are not. Most of them had experienced the economic crisis. When you talk to people who migrate out of countries like Venezuela, in fact, the reason they left is that they couldn't get medical care. It was difficult to survive, so on. You know, uh, it was difficult to survive and so on, you know, for people. But because there's no room to arrive at the border and say, hey, listen, we are victims of your sanctions policy and we can't have medical care. My father has diabetes, needs dialysis. There's only one dialysis machine working in Venezuela. That's why we've arrived here. There's no space for you to say that, you know. No border officer is going to say, well, come in and use our dialysis machines. But if you show up and you say, look, I'm a victim of political persecution, this then confirms all the narratives about, you know, dictatorships in other countries and so on, rather than elucidate the real problem, which is people are fleeing from a lack of services due to the sanctions. So you can see how it's very difficult to talk about imperialism when the migrants themselves are put in a position where they can't talk about the impact of imperialism. They have to reiterate a Cold War narrative, which is what allowed them to get into the country. So this, in fact, has a tendency to not radicalize a lot of migrants, but the other way around, to make them more conservative. And it's not necessarily from their own experiences, which is the, you know, curious fetishism of the 1951 Convention on Refugees. But people have to do that because it confirms why they are in countries like the United States. So I think that's something really interesting, that how the Convention on Refugees, its existence, its narrowness, forces migrants to portray the reason for leaving different than the actual reason for leaving. And the portrayal of this different reason for leaving, political persecution, somehow then will come into the storyline in the United States and reproduce what the people are already supposed to believe, which is that they are the home of freedom and people are fleeing persecution. It reconfirms this idea that the United States is the homeland of freedom in a very perverse way, even though US policy displaced people from their countries and made them flee to the border. It's a very very difficult situation, and I feel for people's organizations that have to even work amongst migrants who would say, well, I fled political persecution. You didn't actually. I know you have to say that, but you really didn't. What you fled is you fled the collapse of your country as a consequence of being squeezed. I think this is a very complicated and difficult situation, but again, imposed on migrants by the narrowness of the United Nations treaties.
Yeah, exactly. That you kind of even covered a bit of the next thing I was going to ask. My co-moderator River and I were talking that exact dichotomy of how you have people that are forced to, we have brutal policy here, brutal detention programs. Biden's expanding the wall. There's an asylum ban, yet like they're still choosing to come here, and they're coming to the place that's creating the conditions, forcing them to come in the first place. And so, is it really just those conditions that are that bad, or it goes into what you're saying with, no, these are generation or through decade policies that the US has enacted, like that has to do with like trade agreements and all sorts of things that have uh, adjusted how and when the like higher classes choose to let people in the border, and when they don't, oh, there's a shortage of work in the agriculture industry. Corporations are going to maybe grant certain things for people to be able to come in and do that labor, because we know Americans don't want to do that. And so, yeah, I totally agree. It's really complicated because yes, it's like they're told we're the land of freedom. There is a process, like barely for them to even come. Um, so yeah, and then just to get back to looking at it in like a more international context, are there like what are like some organizations, like foreign organizations that are doing stuff with migrant rights, rather like how can what should we study outside of our microcosm here at the southern border? Because it's really easy to get wrapped up in border politics, in the US. And so are there similarities elsewhere that we can learn from, maybe in like areas of Asia and that? So
Well, first, I just want to come back to a point you made, which I think is really important, which is there is a general belief that the United States, for instance, is still a general belief that the United States is like a cornucopia. It's a horn of plenty. There's just a lot of wealth and so on. And to some extent, of course, this is true. If you are a person who's struggling to survive, scratching the earth in a place where there's been no rain for a while and so on. You come to the United States, you get a job, even a sub-minimal wage job. You're earning some money and so on. Maybe for you there are some benefits and bright lights, and it's very hard to take away from people that experience. They have real experiences where they earn money and they say, look, I'm doing better here than I was doing at home, despite the fact that the US economy is contracting and so much is wasted on wars and sending weapons to Israel and whatnot. Money that could have been better spent building infrastructure, hiring people in better paid jobs. It's any job is a job that will attract people. It always depends on the conditions of work, how much you get paid, what are the ways in which you're treated and so on. All of that is significant, right? It's important to put on the table. Okay, so that's why people come, and because 1 out of 10 might have a good experience, that 1 out of 10 story is the thing that goes back home. Look, if you walk from Venezuela through the Darien Gap in Panama, you walked up Central America, walked through Mexico, arrived in the US, by some miracle you got into the United States, you have a job in New York. The last thing you're going to tell your family at home is, man, this was a terrible country. Like, you are going to exaggerate your successes, because think about the sacrifices you made to get there. I mean, there's a lot of ideological work here for migrants. There's a lot of shame in admitting a quote unquote failure. There's an enormous amount of shame in that. And I think that's a lot of ideological work. So organizations that work with migrants, I think there's mental health issues here, because people have a problem. A lot has been promised, and here they are, and they just can't make it go, and they don't Their stories don't get told. The stories that get told are the, 1 in 10, 1 in 20 successes. And that attracts more people because they say, well, my friend, went there and they're making a good life and they have this great house. And I also want to go. You're not hearing the stories of the other 9 or the other 19 who are having a tough time. That's a lot of work that a people's organization working with migrants has to do. I think the sort of lifting up the stories of reality, not for any other reason than you need a accurate picture of what's happening with migration, right? You don't want an inaccurate picture to seduce people into very difficult journeys. I've met migrants in Niger who are getting ready to cross the Sahara and then the Mediterranean. And it's good for them to know that once they get to Europe, it's tough going. It's not easy. But on the other hand, these are people who will say to you, look, I have nothing in Nigeria or I have nothing in Ghana. That's why I sold whatever I had and I took a bus and I'm now in Niger and I'm scared, but I'm going to cross the Sahara, where more people die, the IOM says, than in the Mediterranean. A lot of people just die in the passage of migration, but they are being drawn by this narrative that over there, somewhere in Italy or in Germany or in the UK or in the US, success awaits me because migrants who made it, who didn't die in the Sahara, somebody who dies in the Sahara and somebody who dies in the Mediterranean or who dies in the Darien Gap, they don't have stories to tell. And because we don't have enough statistics of the number of migrants who die in perilous circumstances, we don't know how to tell people that, look, this is dangerous. They will turn around and say, so is starvation. And that's why I feel like we need to have a richer conversation about why people migrate. You asked a good question. Are there people outside the US doing things differently, or outside the southern border of the US doing things differently? I would say, most migrant rights organizations that I've interacted with are struggling. The numbers are enormous. People don't know how to keep up with this. It's also, there's a striking, sometimes a striking political variance between the kind of people who work in migrants' rights, often people of the left who get involved in migrants' rights, and they discover that a lot of migrants who move are not people of the left. They are fleeing for all kinds of reasons. Mostly they are fleeing to make good in their lives, and that's a big issue and problem. I've met those organizations in the Sahel region in Africa where people struggle. That the migrant is not interested in a left-wing analysis. They just want to get there because they have it in their head that I can make it. I can be that one. I can be Elon Musk because, after all, wasn't Elon Musk a migrant from South Africa to the United States? This kind of thing is hard to deal with. As I don't think anybody has solved it, and I don't want to, say, oh, somebody else is doing great. I think everybody's struggling. 281 registered people who are migrants is a very large number. Each of the migrant rights groups are what, 5, 6, 3, 4, here some, here some, here some, stretched, having to give legal advice where there's nobody with a real legal degree, or there's somebody who volunteers once in a while. This is hard work. It's admirable work. Nobody is really doing it well. I met migrants' right organization in Bangladesh. They were dealing mostly with the Rohingya refugees coming into Bangladesh. It's an impossible task because there's just like so much. Bangladesh is not a rich country. It's so much work for this. In Lebanon, when I lived for 2 years in Beirut, at the time, 10 years ago, 4 million or 4.5 million Lebanese, 1 million Syrian refugees. Imagine that. Imagine in the United States, 300 million, if you had, let's say, 80 million refugees show up one day. That's what happened in 2013-14. 1 million Syrians crossed into a country of 4.5 million. And of course, with this Israeli bombardment, the Syrians are going back home. because they're like, oh, now it's safer in Syria than in Lebanon. That's the nature of that part of the world as well. Imagine being a migrants' rights person in Lebanon at that point, and there are many migrants' rights organizations. Tough work, my friend. I don't want to exaggerate for you that, somewhere else people are doing a better job. I think everybody's extremely stretched on this. The UN agency, the International Organization of Migration, very stretched. Their funding is very poor. They are not respected by the major powers. They don't take them seriously. But it's the IOM that sits there in Niger handing out bottles of water and sunglasses to people as they try to cross the Sahara in open trucks, and so many of them die. It's IOM, very poorly paid workers who are there, trying to, collect data on how many people made it to Sabah, Libya, and how many died and so on. It's rough work. I mean, because it's not work you can do sitting in an office. You have to go where the migrants are going, and the migrants often go to extremely dangerous places to make these crossings. In the United States, I read a very good book. Forgotten the name of it, but it's a book about how U.S. Border Patrol has stiffened up checks at easy crossing points and forcing migrants into the desert areas of Arizona where they basically die in the desert. They're basically creating the situation for people to go into the desert and die. And that kind of thing means a migrant rights organization has to be sitting in a boiling hot desert, attacked by snakes, and attacked by people who feel that they are vigilantes against migrants. It's crazy work, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I want to use this final question and then maybe tie it into our Q&A for people here over chat. We'll kind of discuss maybe world building or being more forward looking and close this out on, if possible, some sort of positive note. A lot of people in the Tucson community, in migrants' rights, we discuss open borders, border abolition. To me, as a Tucsonan, because globally that's a vague context. What is an open border in, like you're saying, in the places that you're in? But for us, open borders, and at least for me as a Tucsonan, feels freedom of entry of migrants, asylum seekers into the U.S. No persecution, they're not abused, they're not apprehended, and there's systems in place for them to humanely exist in the country. And that's, to me, a form of border abolition. In an ideal world, that's what that would look like. What do you think about it? What is your ideal world in context of border policy? Does that open borders framework, part of it, is it fit in there? Is there somewhere else that we should go to expand on that idea?
I mean, I have very mixed feelings about the debate around open borders because I think there needs to be a conversation and discussion because it's not as easy as it seems. I think it's very important to acknowledge first that most people don't want to move and become somebody's dishwasher, to go through very dangerous journeys and be treated, disparagingly. Like imagine people who have to get to the southern border of the United States, a dangerous journey that many of them have to make, especially those who are coming from south of Mexico. Very dangerous journeys. That Darien Gap, I don't know if you know much about it, but basically it's a death trap for people. It's dangerous. It's just, huge numbers of people trying to cross a little tightly congested forest area. Very dangerous for people. People bringing their children there, the violence that takes place amongst migrants there is terrible. A lot of, smuggling gangs and so on are operating there. This happens in all choke points where migrants travel. I'm not an encourager of this kind of migration. People don't want to leave often their countries and be strangers elsewhere. We shouldn't over glamorize migration. People are often forced to do this. The push factors are much greater than the pull factors. So one of the important things for a left is to fight against the push factors, to fight against regime change policies, to fight against the IMF policies, to fight against climate change, and so on, to fight against the conditions that force people out of their homes on journeys they don't want to make. I think we need to acknowledge that. It's very rare, again, for a migrant who crosses the border to say, I didn't want to make this journey. Going back to what I said earlier. But many of them really don't want to make the journey, especially those, of course, who have terrible traumatic things happen to them during the way. It's dangerous, and opening the border may not help mitigate the danger. It's not going to help that because the danger is along the route. So we have to really think hard about what all this means for people and whether fighting to end the conditions that force people to move is a better politics than merely an open border, which is in fact an idealistic politics. It's going to be very hard to get that in play. On the other hand, it might actually be possible nowadays to fight against the kind of IMF policies, regime change policies, because the world is changing. Many countries don't want austerity imposed on their own people. They are turning to the People's Bank of China. They are turning to the Reserve Bank of India. They're going elsewhere to borrow money than from the European bondholders or the US bondholders who inflict austerity on these countries. Countries are saying, we don't want that. I just had an incredibly interesting meeting with the she's the Minister of Solidarity in Senegal. And I asked her, what's the policy of your government? It's a progressive government. She said, our government's policy is to put the Senegalese people first. It's the first time you hear something like that in a country like Senegal, perhaps since the 1960s. Put the Senegalese people first. Sounds a pretty straightforward statement. Yeah, but it's not so straightforward at all. A lot of people before had put the IMF before the Senegalese people. So they don't want people to feel like they have to run away from their country. And I think that's interesting. We need to, think about that a little bit. Because that if you're going to advocate for open borders, one must also advocate for an end to forced migration, which is what we're really talking about. Most of the 281 million migrants are forced migrants. They don't want to move. The other thing I think with the question of open borders is to take seriously the issue that you have to fight a really serious cultural game to prevent the right wing from pitting migrants against other workers. That's a real, genuine issue that's there in most societies, where it's very easy for the right wing to say migrants are coming in, taking your jobs, rather than that the multinational corporations are not reinvesting their capital in our society and producing, productive jobs. We don't have tax base to produce infrastructure. Rather than say that, they just blame it on the migrants. You have to be prepared to really fight that. And it's not enough to say, oh, the statistics show that migrants don't take away the job. Nobody eats statistics. Statistics are useful, but they are not sufficient. You need much more than that. You need a genuine political movement that is willing to stand up there and make the case. And look at the United States. Neither of the mainstream parties are willing to make the case that migrants in general are not the problem, that the problem is the lack of investment in society, not migrants. Neither of the political parties are willing to make that argument, to help the culture understand that it's an investment problem, not a migration problem. You don't have a job because it's underinvestment. It's not that the migrant is taking your job. I mean, you said earlier, there are jobs that people in the United States don't want to take. In fact, there are jobs that people in the United States don't want to take because they're badly paid and the conditions are bad. And that's a consequence of underinvestment and overclaiming of profit. So my view is open borders is the easiest position to take because it's the most humane sounding position. But there are other aspects to it, I think, that really need to be on the table, particularly the question of forced migration, the one that I went over the most. And then the second, the really serious political dilemma of you don't want to, have migrants enter and then be treated as second-class citizens or have violence inflicted on them and so on. That's irresponsible. One has to have a responsible political position where unless there's sufficient political clarity that the migrant isn't the problem, I think it's dangerous to welcome migrants into a society.
Totally. Yeah. And I agree with just about all of that. But like with your point, and yeah, people then feeling encouraged to go through the Darien Gap. That's terrible for that situation to be made available to them. for us being like in our Sonoran Desert, I mean, I read that our bordered area is like, if not the most, one of the most deadly land-based borders in the world. And by putting up a wall and not having that flow of people in, like we know they're coming, like we've addressed, like they have this idea, we know they're coming. And so, yeah, it is that first part of it. It could save lives, but you know, but then they're encouraged to come. But for us and what we see and what I know organizations here that are out in the field, out on that border, it would have an impact on saving lives. You know, we know that these people are coming. So that's like I agree with everything. That's just the only kind of pushback I would have to your argument.
No, it's quite right. The main point, I think, is this is a really complicated issue. And one can't sit on open borders as if that's an easy solution. That's all, We have to, as sensitive people, we have to constantly tear apart our own fixities and certainties. I would like a world of open borders, but what does that mean, in all its aspects? And so I think you're absolutely correct. When somebody arrives at the Rio Grande, it's much safer to have an open border policy than drive people, to the most difficult deserts to die. That's an act of murder, institutional murder. The Border Patrol in the United States is conducting institutional murder. But on the other hand, that solves the problem of the person at the Rio Grande. But open borders doesn't solve the person, who's deciding to set off from their home in
Right.
El Salvador. So it's just this. It's the uneasy complexity of some of our ideas that we need to be honest about.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. All right. If people have questions, I'm going to check chat. If anyone here wants to have a question, just come on up so that we can hear you. Just make sure you'd say that. You'd slow down. Um, I know it's a lot to take in. Let's see. Sure.
Yeah.
Come over here.
So it took some time to do the original treaty, I'm sure. But what do you think is a strategic timeline for addressing some of these things? And do you think it's worth applying pressure through the UN, or do you think it's worth applying pressure there as well as other places? I'm most interested in leverage points for situations like this. Like, where do we apply the leverage now and in the next decade? Yeah.
I mean, this is a tough one. What I would say is, look, the Global Justice Center cannot approach the UN to say, let's revisit the treaty, But what could happen, which could be interesting, is to consider, who are the countries that are sending the most migrants? Would they be interested in having a conversation about the treaty? Now, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that. If I asked you, which is the country with the largest number of immigrants, what would you say? I don't know what people will say. If I ask, what are the top 5 largest sending countries? I bet you won't get, the 5, but maybe you will. Basically, the largest sending country in the world is India. And that may be shocking because, in fact, the Indians don't all reach the United States. Many Indians go to Africa, many Indians go to Europe, many Indians go to the Gulf. Gulf is a big point. They're the largest sending country. Second is Mexico, and that I think it's ipso facto for people in the United States, large number of people from Mexico. But Mexicans aren't all coming to the US. There are Mexicans going to Europe. There are Mexicans going to other parts of South America and so on. And they're not all, people who can't farm and so on. There are professionals amongst both the Indians and Mexicans that are going abroad, large numbers of professionals. These countries don't want to lose their professionals either, so they have a vested interest in the conversation. Number three is Russia. And that, as I think, largely a consequence of the situation now. But in fact, the data on this comes from before the war in Ukraine. And these are Russians who are moving to Europe to look for work, look for jobs. Also, Russians who move to Central Asia. A very large number of Russians move to Central Asia. Then comes China. China is the next country with large. Now, you can say, well, these countries have large populations. But the fifth is Syria, and that's because of the attempt to destroy the Syrian government. You have to go really far down to get to, say, if you agglomerated all the West African countries, they would actually come into the top 5 if you agglomerated all the countries, because they're much smaller states. But it could be interesting to approach countries that are actually have themselves a public conversation about the problems of out-migration, and they pursue the issue of a new treaty. That could be interesting, but it's a very long way to go for that. Right now, the Europeans have done something vicious. This is not very well. I've been reporting on this for years. Nobody pays any attention. Before the progressive coup d'etats in the Sahel region, France created a structure called G5 Sahel, bringing 5 Sahel countries just below the Sahara. And the French led a process to export technologies of surveillance that are illegal in Europe to these Sahel countries. They were paying them to pass laws to prevent migrants going through the Sahel. So in fact, the Europeans had moved their southern border from north of the Mediterranean to south of the Sahara Desert. It's an act of incredible hubris. The United States tried this. The United States tried to put money into Mexico to have Mexico actually move the US border to Mexico's southern border and prevent people from Central and South America coming upward, and also people from Asia coming through that land border. So the United States tried that. Europeans established it. These coups d'etats that took place in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, these governments have annulled those agreements. And they've said, look, if a migrant wants to go through, there's a 1951 treaty, there's the IOM. We're not going to stop them. They can come in from Ghana and they can go out to Libya. As far as we are concerned, they can do that. It's dangerous, but they can do that. So this is an attempt to actually physically stop people from going. So a lot of countries in the global south have actually started conversations about why people are migrating, whether it's a good idea. In fact, after a long period of time, I heard the phrase brain drain be used in some of these countries, that they're losing professionals. Jamaica has started a debate against brain drain because Jamaican nurses who are trained by public money are then going to New York or going to London to work in hospitals in the West. And Jamaica is losing them because the IMF said that Jamaica has to keep their public wage bill down. They can't pay nurses higher salaries. So they're going out after being trained on the public exchequer. So, these debates are happening in small ways in the global south. It'd be very interesting to see if these countries would be interested in putting some kind of pressure, although I think it's a long way to go.
Yeah. You're able to see the chat, right? Because we have a question in there. You want to address it?
Yeah.
I can read it too.
Yeah.
So question from Gabriela says, you mentioned the IMF often. I find my own Pacific migrant communities here in Aotearoa, which is a different but connected context to Latin America. It's New Zealand. Thank you. Sorry about the pronunciation. There's a lot of manufactured propaganda around Chinese debt trap diplomacy within the Pacific Islands, as you know, to support US warmongering and military control. What are some ways we can talk to our families and our communities about the difference between IMF, World Bank, and China's loan policies in the global south?
Well, firstly, Gabriela, I'm going to be in New Zealand for the first time in about 8-9 days. and also Australia. I've never been to that part of the world. So I'm pretty excited to come there. I've only seen that part of the world through watching cricket matches and watching Lord of the Rings. So this is going to be something quite interesting. I'm told it's very beautiful, and I'm going to get a chance to go to Wellington and Palmerston and I mean, I don't know where all. Anyway, I mean, the fact is that there is no Chinese debt trap diplomacy. I mean, the Atlantic magazine ran a very good article written by two US scholars. I don't remember. It's called something like Chinese debt trap diplomacy. It's in the Atlantic, and I think it's not behind a paywall. Anyway, they looked at one of the emblematic cases in Sri Lanka, the port of Hambantota. So interesting. These American scholars, mainstream people, in a mainstream magazine wrote and said, wait a minute, there really isn't a debt trap diplomacy because there is no debt trap. The Chinese are giving money for infrastructure. In the case of Hambantota, the Sri Lankan government at the time of Rajapaksa mishandled the money. They did a bad job with the money. But that's not on the Chinese. There's a big difference between the IMF and Chinese loans. IMF loans are instinctively austerity driven. What they say is that we're giving you money to basically start your growth going, but you're going to have to cut subsidies, cut welfare programs, cut the public wage bill, cut the public sector and dynamize the private sector. The Chinese show up and have the exact opposite advice. They basically say, we're going to bring money here. We're not going to give it into the state exchequer without a plan. You need a plan. You need infrastructure that you want to build. When you build serious infrastructure, a port, a road, a railway line, and so on, we're going to back that with funding. Why? Because we know that's going to grow the economy rather than put the money into paying off last year's debts. Chinese don't lend to pay off last year's debts. There are other ways to deal with that. You can get currency swaps and so on to deal with last year's debt, but they don't use their lending to pay off debts. They use their lending to build infrastructure. It's a very different quality of loan. They are not the same. And so I think that's important. I don't know whether that's going to be, that's going to convince anybody in one's family or friend circle, because you are riding against an enormous wave of cliches. Some of it is just racist cliches about, the Chinese, the yellow peril coming out to get you, to grab you. This is a very old 19th century European idea, the Chinese invasions, and so on. The fear of China goes back before the colonization of the Rim, Hong Kong and so on, before the first Opium War, because China was the biggest economy at that time in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Until 1820, China had a booming economy. Now, they had the internal problems, serious internal problems, but the economy was one of the largest in the world. It's only after 1820 that they go into what they call the century of humiliation. Very hard to talk today to people who are so convinced that China is a force of evil in the world. It's really hard to talk to people. I wrote a piece, I don't know, a year and a half ago called, Can we have an adult conversation about China? And the answer is, of course, no.
All right. I don't know if we have any other questions, and I also think we could be at time. Oh, here's one from Sam. Vijay, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Sammy. I'm a Lebanese Palestinian American in Austin, Texas. From your point on Syrian migration to Lebanon, I see a lot of hatred, mainly online, from many Lebanese people towards Syrian migrants. Is this something you've experienced during your time in Lebanon? It pains me a bit as an Arab to see tension between Syrians and Lebanese since we're all dealing with a common enemy.
I really feel for Sammy right now, and I understand the common enemy issue, but I'd say that in 2012, 13, 14, during the conflict in Syria, I think, there's a couple of things that were happening that are difficult to understand. One is that the Syrian migrants who crossed the border were often people, who were, I don't want to say this in a very broad strokes way, because obviously this is not exactly everybody who migrated, but a lot of people, were sort of pious religious people, because it was around those issues, that axis, that civil war, the civil strife took place inside Syria. I mean, the forces in Turkey that were trying to lead the rebellion were the Muslim Brotherhood. There were sections of Al-Qaeda involved and so on. So people who the Syrian state might have thought were sympathetic to those forces fled into Lebanon. And that produced a social crisis in Lebanon between, let's say, communities like the Christians and others who thought too many Sunni Muslims were entering, or the numbers of the Shiites were increasing, or there were too many Alawites. I mean, the sectarian nature and sectarian arithmetic in Lebanon was really disturbed by that large influx of Syrians. This played a big role in it. And, somebody made a joke the other day, Sammy, it's a very off-color joke, but they said if only the Christians in Lebanon knew that the way to get rid of the Syrians was for the Israelis to invade, they might have invited them to invade earlier. It's a very off-color joke, but it actually comes to the heart of the dilemma, that the sectarian issue inside Lebanon cannot be underestimated, and it needs to be overcome, particularly now. I mean, the Israelis are bombing inside Beirut. They are not, in fact, concerned whether the one who's bleeding is a Sunni or a Shia or even a Maronite and so on. It's not a concern of theirs. Their bunker buster bombs are everywhere. I mean, they dropped 85 bunker buster bombs in the hit that killed Syed Hassan Nasrallah. That one bombing on that one day was more bunker buster bombs than the US used against Iraq in 2003. And which was, Operation Shock and Awe, massive bombing of Iraq. But this one bombing was more bunker buster bombs than all of the attacks in 2003 against Iraq from March till December. That's pretty stunning. And like you, I hope at some point that this will create its own realization, and that really quite ugly sectarian agreement, concord in Lebanon will be overcome, and people will be able to see themselves either as Arabs or as Lebanese, not, first see everything through the sectarian lens, because that produced a lot of that anti-Syrian hatred in that period.
Thank you, Vijay. I appreciate it.
All right. I think that is it for today. Thank you so much for your time, Vijay. I think we got a lot out of this, and we will proceed accordingly with our organizing.
Okay, take care of yourselves, all of you, and see you later. Yeah, stay in touch. Bye. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care of yourself.
You too.